Everyday me, everyday God. The thin space of our why questions. Have you ever noticed that when we get into intense situations or intensely painful, intensely frightening situations, that suddenly why questions pop up and we suddenly find ourselves crying out, why? Why, God? Why this? Why that? Well, over the last weeks, I've had several conversations that have been focused on big why questions, not the everyday little questions of why, but the big ones. You know, those big ones that suddenly drop us into a deep heart place, a deep soul place. They're those places where it's like the thick spaces of life get pushed back and suddenly things become quite clear, intensely clear. The issues of love and rejection, of despair and hope, of death, loss maybe, of evil. So they're big questions. And I want to refer to them as thin spaces. And I want to call them thin spaces because I think it's when we get dropped into those deep places that there isn't much room to maneuver. It's really thin. And we feel squeezed into places, into that place that forces questions out of us and forces us to be awakened to what's really important in life. I think it's a place where I often have a sense that when we're at the heart of deep why questions, it's a place where it feels like a part of our very self is being torn from another part of our very self. It's like our own very self is being torn, kind of ripped apart, and we're left wounded, bloody sometimes, raw. And it is out of that place that the agonizing whys just pop out. I think it's been very helpful for me to realize that Jesus had his own thin space of why questions, of big why questions. When Jesus was hanging naked, battered, bruised, mocked, jeered, helpless on the cross, at that point just before his death, in a thin space, he cried out, why? Why have you abandoned me, God? Why have you forsaken me? But isn't that kind of strange? Because Jesus is God. Jesus was God. Well, maybe it was that place where Jesus experienced the fullness of our humanness, our own human experience, where there is a thin space that separates us from ourselves. And the very fullness of Jesus was up against the fullness of his divinity, his godness, his goodness, his holiness. And it was being torn apart. It was being torn in a way that left him raw. And I think it's very helpful because Jesus gets our human thin space. And in those thin spaces, it's good to know that Jesus' Calvary, his cross, was not the end. It was part of the journey, part of his humanness journey. And there was life. There was glory that came. but glory came with scars to remind us all, and Jesus, of what the journey had been like. And so for you and I, our why places, our thin places where the why questions shoot out of us, it's not the end, but it is part of our very human journey. And perhaps our big why questions are our Calvary, our cross. When something dies and gets separated, and we too have scars of our Calvaries. We too have questions, why questions that we have cried out in agony. Did Jesus get an answer to his why questions? We didn't hear them. They weren't written about. Will we get answers to our big why questions? Seldom. But they're really important to ask. They're really important to cry out, why, God, why? Because the very fact of us crying out those why questions engages us in a very close dialogue, an intimate, kind of robust wrestling with our Creator God. And maybe more important than the answers to the question, why, is that in direct engagement between our human journey and the journey of Jesus. And maybe our thin spaces of agony bring us very close to God, maybe some of the closest spaces we experience in our human journey. So is it okay to cry out, why? Why, God? Why have you forsaken me? Of course it is. Of course it is. That is the question, because it feels like we've lost God, like God's not there. But it is that engagement. Will God rescue us from our agony? Sometimes, but not always. Will God remove the loss, the pain? Sometimes, but not always. But those places of our agony, of our thin spaces when we cry out, why, God, why? They form and shape us in ways that we don't know until we come through to the new life place in our human journey. Then we look back and we know that we've made it through. And so when we have an agonizing, deep heart experience, we will remember we've been here before and Jesus has brought us through. We will get through and we are not alone. In that thin place, when we're pressed up so close to God, Jesus hears, Jesus knows, Jesus gets it. Jesus is present with you and with me in those deep heart, deep soul places where we get torn and wounded. And even when we cannot feel God is present, He is present. So if you squeeze right up against, as close as you can get in that thin space, and if we take a big deep breath and we listen carefully, we will hear the heartbeat of love of God. You will hear the heartbeat of God. It's there in that deep heart space, that deep place of big why.